Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to another episode of Diplomatic Enclave. I'm your host, Khalid. But the countries whose envoy I'm going to be interviewing today is one that is the second largest in the world after Russia, but has a population that is less than Tokyo's metropolitan area. Not only that, it has got the world's largest coastline, the world's longest street, and so many other facets to it that we will be discussing in detail with the envoy of Canada in this very episode of Diplomatic Enclave. Stay tuned. Welcome back, and finally we are in the High Commission in conversation with the vibrant High Commissioner of Canada, His Excellency Mr. Perry Colderwood. Sir, thank you very much to have joined us.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here with you.
It's our pleasure, sir. So first of all, I've heard you quite new over here. How long have you been in Pakistan?
Well, actually, I've been in Pakistan for nearly a year now.
Nearly a year. All right. So I take my words back.
So I don't really feel new anymore, but I still have a lot to learn because your country is so diverse and beautiful and interesting, and the time has gone by very quickly. But I have been here for nearly a year, and I'm enjoying it very much.
Have you had the occasion to visit Pakistan a bit during this 1 year?
Well, I should say, firstly, I had never been to Pakistan or to Asia at all.
All right.
Before I arrived here last year. My career, I've been 30 years in the diplomatic service. My career has been largely in Africa and in Latin America. So it's very exciting for me to come to Pakistan and come to Asia to discover a whole new world. I have made a point of traveling as much as possible within Pakistan. As a diplomat, I believe it's very important in any country to travel around the country and get out of the embassy or the High Commission and get out of the capital city in order to really understand and appreciate the diversity of the country. I think it's especially important in Pakistan because your country is so large and so diverse. I've been to Karachi a number of times. I've been to Lahore, been to Swat, Sawabi, Multan, Bahawalpur, and I'm looking forward to going to Gilgit-Baltistan in the months ahead. And I found each part of the country very interesting and unique in its own way, with its own history, its own culture, its own languages. So that's a part of the job I'm enjoying very much, getting out and meeting people and seeing the diversity of Pakistan.
All right, I feel that's a great thing that you're saying, because many diplomats that I've talked to have in the beginning have had apprehensions about the country and the people and the society. Once they're here, they don't want to go back. Has that been the case with you and your colleagues as well?
Well, I certainly haven't had apprehensions. As I mentioned, I had not been to Pakistan before I came here. But I have had over the years many very good Pakistani friends in Canada, and diplomatic colleagues from Pakistan at other missions that I've served at around the world. So I was already familiar with Pakistani food. I already knew that Pakistani people, generally speaking, were very warm and hospitable. So I really didn't come here with any apprehensions at all. I came here instead with a great sense of excitement and the opportunity to explore and discover a new country and part of the world.
Well, Excellency, you also represent a country whose Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, is very popular in Pakistan. He's very flamboyant. He's somebody that we can kind of relate to. Is that the image that Canada gives to the world, a country that one can relate to?
Well, in my experience, and Pakistan is my 8th diplomatic posting abroad, so I've spent many years abroad. My experience has been, generally speaking, that Canada has a good image internationally. We're well perceived, and I think we're accurately viewed as a very open and welcoming society. We're a society and a country that's very much built on immigration. If you visit Canada, you will see, especially in our cities, that there are people from all parts of the world speaking different languages and different religions and different food and different culture and so forth. So I think people from virtually any part of the world, including Pakistan, can see that Canada is a country that is open to them and welcoming to everyone. It's a very open society, and I think Prime Minister Trudeau, I do understand that he's very popular in Pakistan. Many people have mentioned it to me, the government that he leads, and he personally is very committed to the idea of diversity and inclusion. And we certainly see our country, Canada, as being a country that's enriched by the fact that we're so diverse. The Canadians come from all different parts of the world, and they're also Indigenous Canadians, of course. And this diversity makes the country a more interesting and exciting place to live.
And also an exciting place to go visit someday for all the Pakistanis who've been going and all those who are interested still in visiting the country. Speaking of Canada, what does the word Canada mean? What are the origins of the word?
Well, it's a very good question, and I'm not asked it very often, but our belief is that it comes from some of our indigenous languages. There's a word Kanata, which means settlement, in the Iroquois and Huron indigenous languages, and it's believed, the prevailing theory is that when the early explorers came from France to Canada in the early 1500s, they met indigenous people who used this word Kanata in pointing these explorers to the settlements. So Kanata became the term that was used for that area in Quebec, where the European explorers first arrived. And then over time it caught on and simply became the term used for the entire country. And then later on in our history it became the formal name of Canada.
That's very interesting, because that's what a lot of names of different countries have a certain origin, have a certain meaning. And it's quite interesting to try to understand or decipher what all of that means, because there's always some kind of relation to its history or its ethnicity. Speaking of which, how many different ethnicities are present currently in Canada?
Well, it would be difficult for me to give you a precise number, because as I said, we have people from all around the world. Our First Nations, and that's how we refer to our Indigenous people, they alone comprise about 60 different languages and around 500 different tribal or ethnic groups. So there are hundreds of Indigenous communities to start with, many of which are quite small in number. Following that, if you look back at Canadian history, initially it was French settlers who came over, and later British. So there's a very strong French and British imprint on Canada, reflected in our two official languages, which are French and English. In more recent times, as I was saying, we've received immigrants from virtually around the world. So if you were to go to Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver, you can find literally hundreds of different languages spoken on the street, and people from virtually every corner of the world, if you were to look for them. So in many ways, Canada really is a microcosm of the world. And part of that mélange, that mixture, is the Pakistani community, of course, which is increasingly prominent in Canada. We estimate that there may be around 300,000 Canadians of Pakistani heritage. And certainly if you go to a city like Toronto, you'll have no difficulty finding people who speak Urdu and Punjabi, and you will find wonderful restaurants serving Pakistani food as well, and other manifestations of the culture of Pakistan. But the same could be said of many other cultures around the world, which are reflected and found in Canada through the immigrants from those countries.
Speaking of immigrants and your immigration policy, a lot of people, whether it be from Europe, what from your point of view as a Canadian, is which attracts these people from all over the world to Canada?
Well, I guess firstly I would say, as I mentioned before, Canada is a country that has been very much built on immigration, and our current government and Canadian society at whole continues to be committed to welcoming immigrants and to being open to immigration. We see that as the way that we can continue to build our country. Immigrants and also refugees. I should mention Canada is a country that receives many refugees in recent times from Syria. In particular, we received about 40,000 last year, and we'll probably receive a similar number this year. So I think many people outside Canada are aware, firstly, that Canada is a country that is open to immigration, so there is a possibility to go there. Secondly, I think many people around the world see Canada as a country of opportunity and a country of the future. We are a country that's still growing. We're only 36 million people, which is small compared to a country like Pakistan. There's something like 200 million Pakistanis.
Despite the fact that it's the second largest country in the world, the population is even lesser than that of Tokyo.
That's correct. So we're 36 million. We continue to grow, and we need immigrants to continue to build the country. So I think a lot of the people who choose to immigrate to Canada, they see it as a country where they personally can pursue their dreams and their ambitions, but they also see it as a country that has a bright future ahead of it, and a country that is still growing and expanding.
Well, Ambassador, the strength of any country comes through a good governance, a good administration. Now, speaking of Canada, you've got a parliamentary system that is within the context of a constitutional monarchy. Could you kindly elaborate a bit more on that?
Yes, certainly. As you've said, we do have a constitutional monarchy and a parliamentary system. Our head of state is Queen Elizabeth, who of course is also the head of state of Great Britain and of 14 or 15 other countries around the world. In the case of Canada, the Queen is represented by a Governor-General. Her powers are exercised by a Governor-General on her behalf, and that person is a Canadian citizen and is nominated by the Prime Minister for a 5-year term. Interestingly, just a few days ago, our new Governor-General was just announced by the Queen, and it is a woman named Julie Payette, who is an astronaut. So our Governor-Generals come from different backgrounds, and many of them have been very interesting and very distinguished people. Beneath the Governor-General, the government itself is run by a Prime Minister and his cabinet, and in that way would be similar to Pakistan, where you have a president playing a largely ceremonial role, and then the Prime Minister and cabinet are the ones actually running the government. It's the executive branch. Our Prime Minister, as we've already mentioned, is Justin Trudeau, and he has a cabinet of 30 ministers. All of our ministers are elected to Parliament, as is the case in Pakistan, although in Pakistan your ministers come from both chambers. In the case of Canada, our ministers all come from the lower house, which is the House of Commons. Our upper house, our senators are appointed. So that's basically our federal system. It's largely modelled on the British system, given that we had been a British colony previously.
So, Ambassador, how long is a tenure in the House of Commons or in the Senate?
The tenure in the House of Commons is normally 4 years. Constitutionally, it can be as long as 5 years, but the culture, the tradition is we have elections every 4 years. So our current government was elected in 2017. The next elections will be in 2019. Our Senate, to some extent, is modelled after the British House of Lords. As I mentioned, people are appointed to the Senate, and they can stay there until the age of 75.
All right, 75.
If they wish to. Some decide to leave sooner, but they can stay until that time if they wish.
Of course. So now with the House of Commons, the Senate, you in Canada are a federation that is composed of 10 provinces and 3 territories, and in turn they are also grouped into 4 main regions. Now, how are all of these governed?
Well, the federation aspect is fundamental to the way Canada works. We are a federation and have been since Canada was first created as an entity in 1867. From the beginning, there's a distribution of powers between the federal government and the provincial governments, and we are, compared to most other countries, quite a decentralized country. There are a lot of powers in the hands of our 10 provinces, and our constitutional acts outline specifically areas which are in the jurisdiction of the provinces and those which are in the jurisdiction of the federal government. As an example, education is a provincial jurisdiction, the delivery of health care, control of natural resources is at the level of the provinces. The federal government, on the other hand, is responsible for broad macroeconomic policy, for foreign policy, for defense. And then there are some areas like transport and environment where both levels of government have a responsibility and they work together. It's a model that I believe has worked very well in Canada. As you mentioned earlier, Canada is a huge country, the second largest in the world. In terms of area, we're about 11 times larger than Pakistan, and Pakistan itself is a large country. So it's an immense country and it's very diverse. If you travel to different parts of the country, you'll see that the economy varies from one region to another. There are some parts of the country that are agricultural or focus on mining. There are others that are very industrialized. In terms of ethnicity, we have parts of the country where French is the dominant language, other parts English. So the fact that we're decentralized allows the provincial governments to tailor and develop policies that are relevant and appropriate for their particular needs for their region. I think another advantage of the federal model is, especially for a big country like Canada, it brings government closer to the people. If you're living on the Pacific coast of Canada, you're 4,000 kilometers away from the capital. And I think it's important and useful that a lot of government policies and programs are administered by the province so that people are closer to political leaders on issues such as education and health that I refer to.
All right, you talk of education and health. Now, these are two very important aspects that the Canadian government puts a lot of interest towards. Speaking of education, a 2012 OECD report mentions you as being the world's most educated country. How important is education to you, and what are the different policies that govern the educational system in your country?
Well, I think most Canadians are very proud of our education system. I do agree that it's a good system on the whole, and perhaps one of the best in the world. As I mentioned, it's largely run at the provincial level. We have primary and secondary education, as you find anywhere else in the world. At the higher level, we have universities, including many world-class universities, and I'm delighted that we have growing numbers of Pakistani students studying there. We also have what we call community colleges, which are basically technical training institutions, because we believe very strongly that for the Canadian economy, and I think this applies to most economies around the world, we not only need people with an academic background and lawyers and doctors and so forth, but we also need people with technical skills. The economy needs it. So our young people, some will choose to go to university if they're more academically oriented. Others will go to our community colleges, which have a trade focus. Our model of community colleges has been widely recognized as a very strong one. We have good partnerships between government, the business community, and the colleges themselves to identify the needs of the economy in particular regions, and to ensure that we're offering courses and training to prepare young people with the skills they need to find jobs in their region. So I think that's an innovative element of the Canadian educational system.
How do you govern the health system in your country? Is it similar to what is in Europe with the social security system, or is it a bit different?
We've had universal free health care in Canada since the early 1970s. So it's been for over 40 years now that all Canadian citizens have access to free health care. And it's a system that Canadians are proud of. On the whole, it's worked very well. There has been debate in recent years about some challenges related to the system as the population grows older. Canada, like many developed countries, is seeing the average age get older as people are living longer, precisely because healthcare is good, but also because of a low birth rate. We have growing numbers of older people and fewer younger people, which is putting some strain on the system. But there is a very strong commitment on the part of Canadian governments, both at the federal and the provincial level, to maintaining the integrity of universal healthcare, free healthcare for all people. And on the whole, it's worked well. And in many ways, it would be similar to the systems in place in some European countries. It's not unique to Canada having universal free healthcare.
All right. Well, that's great, because health, education, and of course economy are three important pillars of any nation that bring a nation amongst other community of nations and bring it to a certain level. Speaking of economy, you are the world's 10th largest economy, and you're a highly globalized one. Now, what are the different sectors of the economy, and what are the success ratios of all these sectors in your point of view?
Well, the first thing I would say about our economy is that we're a country blessed with tremendous natural resources as a large country, and very well endowed in that regard. If you look at our history, our economic history, in the earlier years of Canada, our development was very much on the basis of exploiting our natural resources, starting with agriculture and forestry and fisheries, and later on moving into energy and mining. And in all of those areas, we continue to be very strong. That said, in the last 50 years or so, the Canadian economy has become very diversified beyond these primary industries. All of those are still important, and important in particular regions of Canada, but we also are a very advanced manufacturing country. We produce automobiles in huge numbers, aircraft, helicopters, computers. We have ICT companies, information and communications technology, that are state of the art. So we are no longer a country of miners and agriculturalists exclusively. We're also a country of first-rate, state-of-the-art technology in many areas. As you travel across the country, you'll see our economy varies from region to region. There are some provinces like Saskatchewan, which is the grain basket, the great wheat production of Canada. So if you go there, you'll see that agriculture is very prominent in their economy. There are other regions where mining continues to be very important. Whereas if you go to the most populous provinces, the biggest ones, Ontario and Quebec, these are economies that are very much manufacturing and services, everything from engineering companies to financial services, environmental services, and so forth. So it's a very diverse economy. As you mentioned, it also is a very globalized economy. Canada, given that our domestic market is fairly small, since there are only 36 million Canadians, we discovered or reached the conclusion many years ago that our growth and our welfare depended on trade and exporting to foreign markets. About a third of our gross national product comes from exports. And over the years, we've negotiated a number of free trade agreements with other countries. You're probably aware of NAFTA, which links us to the United States and Mexico with a free trade agreement. We've just recently signed a free trade agreement with the European Union, and we have several others with some Latin American and East Asian countries. And all of this is because the Canadian economy, because of its relatively small size, is integrated globally and depends very heavily on exports for maintaining our standard of living.
All right. But as far as economic partners are concerned, you talked about the European Union, you talked about the United States, Mexico, but you don't have any major Asian partners, do you?
Well, trade with China has grown enormously in recent years, and China is now our second biggest export market, although far behind the United States. The United States leads, and that's not surprising given that it's right next door and it's an enormous market. About 75% of our exports go to the United States, and more than 50% of our imports come from there. So the US is at the top of the list, and far behind. China and Japan are important partners, as are Britain and Germany and France, and Mexico is also important. But when we look towards the future, we believe very much in diversifying trade as much as possible. A lot of the growth in the world economy in the future is not going to be in Europe or Japan or the United States or Canada, because these are mature economies that are growing at 1 or 2% a year. It's the countries like Pakistan and India and continents like Africa where the growth is likely to come in the years ahead. So in that context, we're very keen to increase our presence in those markets and explore opportunities for trade and investment as well in other parts of the world.
When you talk of exporting markets in different countries, some that you have a contract with, an agreement with, and others that you're interested in, what would you classify as your major exports?
Some of our biggest exports globally include automobiles. In fact, Canada and the United States, I've already referred to the intense trade, and actually it's nearly $2 billion a day in trade between the two countries. It's very intense, but our two countries have had a bilateral auto agreement that dates back to the 1960s, whereby there was free trade in automobiles. So automobiles and parts is very high. We're also a very major energy exporter, oil and gas, mostly to the United States. Again, they're right next door, and they're a net importer of oil and gas. We're a net exporter. But we export many other things, agricultural products, including to Pakistan in particular. We export oil seeds and lentils and other agricultural products. We export lumber. Also, as I was saying earlier, we also produce aircraft and helicopters and computers and all these things. So increasingly, they play an important role in our export balance sheet as well. So it's really quite diversified.
All right. When you talk of any avenue, whether it be economy or your general governance or the different types of administrations that you have, there is a certain level of gender equality that we see in Canada. Has it always been the case with your country to give equal importance to men and women?
Well, the short answer is no. I think as a Canadian, I can say I'm proud at the progress that we have made. We've come a long way. And I think if you look at any country around the world,
there has been a gradual progress in that
there's
side.
progress and it takes time. But in the case of Canada, we've made significant progress. And I think something that symbolizes this and demonstrates the commitment of our government is the fact that the government led by Prime Minister Trudeau includes 15 women ministers and 15 ministers who are men. So there's gender parity at the highest level of our government. And this is the first time in Canada's history that we've had this. We're also seeing, for example, in our diplomatic corps, we're getting close to half of our ambassadors and high commissioners abroad are women. And in government in Ottawa, there are growing numbers of women in senior positions. We're seeing the same trend in the private sector as well. We're not at gender parity by any means, but certainly if you compare where we were 30 or 40 years to where we are now, there are far more women on the boards of companies, and we're seeing large numbers of women starting new businesses in Canada also. So on the whole, I think we've come a long way. We still have some progress to make. I would also add that in our foreign policy and our development policy, we're very committed to promoting gender equality. And the reason is because we believe that in terms of achieving development and combating poverty, probably the most important thing to do is to ensure that all citizens are fully engaged in the life of their country. And that means women as well as men. In many countries around the world, well, virtually all, I would say, historically, women have tended to be marginalized and often discriminated against. So in our foreign policy and our development policy, we work with other countries, including with Pakistan, to empower women and find ways to ensure that they're not discriminated against and that they have all the opportunities that men have to contribute to their economies and to pursue their goals and ambitions.
Exactly, I think that is the only way forward to bring women at par with men, because that is how a society gets strengthened, because women in the household, kind of like in Pakistan, it's the women who manage the house. The men are just there to sometimes provide finances. In most of the cases, even the women now handle that aspect of the household. But Canada also has a very important role when it comes to other aspects such as climate change, such as conservation. How dedicated have you been towards these two important processes?
Well, starting with climate change, our current government, led by Prime Minister Trudeau, is very committed to climate change. Our government was elected just a few weeks before the Paris conference, which adopted the Paris Agreement on climate change. Our Prime Minister and our Minister of Environment were at Paris and were very active in the negotiations that led to that agreement. We're very committed because we see within Canada itself, we're already seeing the impact of climate change in a lot of negative ways. You may have seen on the news just in recent days, forest fires in Western Canada. There always are forest fires, it's part of nature, but we've seen in recent years with warmer temperatures and drier conditions that there are more forest fires. Last year we saw a major Canadian town that was devastated, almost wiped out altogether by a forest fire. That's one example. We're seeing in the Arctic of Canada ice melting, which in many ways is having an impact on the lifestyle of the the indigenous people, the Inuit there. So we're already seeing in Canada the impact of climate change, but we're also acutely aware that around the world, countries around the world are going to suffer the consequences of climate change, and Pakistan is a country that's particularly vulnerable, according to experts on global warming. So we believe that we all have a moral obligation, an obligation to future generations to do our utmost to curtail global warming as much as possible, and also to work together to take steps to mitigate the impact of global warming. On the more positive side, we also see opportunities being presented in terms of renewable and new forms of energy. Canadian companies are at the forefront of efforts to develop cheaper, more affordable solar power, wind energy. I'm pleased that we're even seeing Canadian companies in the area of solar energy coming to Pakistan to look at investments in this country. So there will be some economic growth opportunities that come from the transition from the old forms of energy, such as coal and oil, which tend to produce greenhouse gases, to clean energy, such as wind and solar and others. So that's a positive side of the equation. But I assure you that our government's commitment is very firm to the Paris Agreement and to doing our utmost, both domestically and internationally, to minimize as much as possible global warming, which poses such a threat to all of us.
And because that's a very important issue that not only touches on Canada or other countries, but also on, as you said, countries such as Pakistan. It's a global phenomenon, and it's only getting worse by the day, and unless everybody doesn't get together and join hands and work against it and work to stop this, the catastrophe won't take long to come to our heads. We already see the temperatures that are rising and the inequalities that we've been seeing as far as the temperatures and the Arctic, and as you said, the different areas of the world that are changing as per the global warming phenomenon. Now, you talked about the different ethnicities. You said that you've got the indigenous population living there, as well as the other population that comes as immigrants from different countries because your country needs it. That makes a lot of languages spoken in the country, doesn't it? But what are the major languages that you people speak, apart from, of course, there's French, there's English? Are there other languages?
French and English are the two official languages, and that reflects the fact that we were a French colony and then subsequently a British colony. So our federal government works in both languages. Our provinces can decide, each one decides its own language policy, French or English or both. Oh, yeah. At the level of the street, as I was saying earlier, if you go to the big cities especially, Toronto being an example, the biggest city in the country, more than 50% of the population was born outside of Canada in Toronto, and most of those people speak neither English nor French as their first language. So if you walk the streets of Toronto, you will hear Punjabi and Urdu and Spanish, Mandarin, Italian and Greek, all these different languages all mixed together. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we do have the indigenous languages, which are spoken by small numbers of people because our indigenous communities are quite small. And in fact, it's one of the challenges of Canada and of those communities to keep their languages alive. And I've been interested to read in Pakistan also about some of the concerns about keeping cultures alive. In this country, you have something like 70 or 80 languages in Pakistan, depending on how you count them. And the smaller ones, if we don't take steps, and the speakers themselves, if they don't take steps to protect them and ensure that they're part of the education system and government and media, there's a risk that they will fade away.
That's true.
And if a language fades away, much of the culture goes with it, because language tends to be the vehicle for culture. But on the whole, in Canada, we have this great diversity of the two official languages at the national level. Our indigenous languages are official in some regions, especially in the north, and then all these immigrant languages. So it makes for a very dynamic and interesting environment.
All right, Excellency, we talked about the different ethnicities. You've explained it in detail. Now, that also makes your country religiously diverse. And of course, an emphasis on pluralism with the different communities that are there. How important is pluralism to your country?
Well, I think pluralism is essential to who we are and our identity. We usually talk, and our government does, in terms of diversity and inclusion, which is very much along the lines of pluralism. We see the diversity of the country, and that's in terms of language, but also religion and in other ways. We see that as a strength, and the inclusion part underlines the importance of everyone being included in the society, that you're not marginalized if you speak a certain language or if you have a certain religion or if you come from a certain part of the country, that everyone is included. I refer back to my reference to our cabinet of ministers. I said earlier it's half women and half men. We have 4 people in the cabinet who speak Punjabi as a first language. We have our minister for the status of women who was born in Iran. Her parents were Afghan refugees living in Iran, and now she's a minister. Our minister of immigration comes from Somalia. He was a refugee from Somalia who came to Canada. We have a couple of ministers who have disabilities. One who has visual impairment, can't see very well. But the point is that at our highest level of government, everyone is included, whether you have a physical disability or whether you're a Muslim or a Sikh or Jewish, or whether you're a man or a woman or any other form of diversity. You're all part of the society, and everyone has something to contribute. And it's really the essence of what Canada is, this diversity, and it's one of our strengths, the fact that we have the diversity, and it works very well.
Excellency, you've talked about pluralism, about the different ethnicities, the different cultures that reside in Canada. Now, this brings us to mind the different parts, ingredients, influences of the culture that exists in Canada. Could you give us a little tidbit about that?
Well, Canadian culture is very much a reflection of the diversity that we've just been speaking about. So when you look at Canadian authors, the books they're writing, films and other cultural expressions, many of our filmmakers and our authors, our actors, singers, and so forth, many come from different parts of the world, and their heritage is reflected in the work that they do. Canada is very much a country of this diversity, and it makes it difficult to speak in a very clear way about Canadian culture, because Canadian culture is this eclectic mix of so many different things. If you were to visit a Canadian city in the summer, such as Montreal or Montréal, as we say in French, there's a whole series of festivals in the summer, outdoor festivals. One is a jazz festival, which is extremely popular, with free concerts all over the city. And if you go to those concerts, you'll see music from the Caribbean, from Haiti, from Jamaica. You'll hear music from Latin America. You'll hear influences from Pakistan and India. So Canadian culture really is a mix of all of these different influences brought from different parts of the world. And then, as I've referred before, also with our Indigenous peoples, our First Nations, who have contributed in many ways to our culture. It's from them that kayaks have come from. You know what a kayak is? A canoe-like boat used in the Arctic. Toboggan, which Canadians enjoy tobogganing down hills in the winter, is a sport that comes from the Indigenous people. And many of our arts are inspired by Indigenous cultures, which in turn are often inspired by nature.
A lot of people take up the arts as a second profession or a hobby as well. Speaking of yourself, you have taken up the piano. Does the influence of getting interested in the arts, whether as a musician or as an artist, as a secondary hobby, come naturally to Canadians?
Well, I'm not sure if Canadians are any different from anyone else in that regard. We spoke earlier about the importance of education, and I think in Canada, Canadians and the governments have embraced education and recognized that education is so important to building and developing a society and allowing people to fulfill themselves and achieve their goals. Within the context of education, culture, I think, is essential and very important. And I think Canadians on the whole have embraced culture. Personally, I play the piano. That's a cultural expression. But I think Canadians, generally speaking, are very interested in culture, and we have great cultural venues, concert halls, galleries, and so forth across the country, which offer opportunities for Canadians to listen or view culture or to practice it themselves if they're artists of some kind.
So music is one of the things that interests two countries, that also brings two countries together on different fora. But that is also part of the different aspects of a relationship between two countries. Speaking of Canada, what are the main aspects, the pillars of its foreign policy that attracts other countries towards it?
I think I would say that the first pillar is there's a very deep-rooted commitment in Canada to multilateralism. Canada was one of the founding countries of the United Nations. We've been very active throughout the history of the United Nations. It was a Canadian, a former foreign minister and then prime minister, who won a Nobel Prize for peace for being the person who developed the concept of modern United Nations peacekeeping. It was at the time of the Suez Crisis in the late 1950s, and it was former Prime Minister Lester Pearson who was awarded the Peace Prize for taking the initiative to set up a peacekeeping force to separate the opposing sides at that time. So we're very engaged in the United Nations system, but also we're involved in many other international organizations, such as the Commonwealth, that brings us together with Pakistan, the Francophonie, which links us to French-speaking countries, and other groups. So I would say that's one important pillar. Another important pillar is obviously our relationship with our immediate neighbors, with the United States and Mexico. We are a country of North America, and as I've described earlier, in economic terms, we're very integrated with those countries, but also in security terms, we have to work very closely with them to ensure our collective security. Other pillars include our commitment to human rights and democracy and good governance around the world. We speak out publicly on human rights issues often, but in addition, privately, we're very active in working with other governments and partners in other countries to promote what we regard as universal values of human rights. And they're very much along the lines of some of the things we've already discussed, the importance of the dignity and the inclusion of everyone, not discriminating against people because they have a different religion or speak a different language or different nationality or something. And in terms of democracy, we believe very strongly that in any society, people should have the right to select their leaders and enjoy freedom of speech and other basic human rights, which the entire world has signed on to internationally many years ago with the International Convention on Human Rights.
That's great. That's great. I think that's a very important example of a country that is doing so much and is showing its presence in the world community. Now, you are representing Canada and Pakistan. Canada and Pakistan have had a very fruitful relationship since diplomatic relations were established. How would you, as the Canadian envoy, describe that relationship?
Well, as you've said, it is a very long-standing relationship. Canada and Pakistan have been friends since the earliest days, since Pakistan's independence, and we've worked together in many areas over the years. Today, and I've been here for nearly a year now, as I've said, it's a great honor for me to be High Commissioner in Pakistan, because we have a great diversity in the relationship. There's many things going on, and it's a very vibrant and dynamic relationship. We've spoken a bit already about trade relations, and I think there's great potential for increased trade and investment relations between our countries. We have development cooperation program, which is significant. We have Pakistani diaspora in Canada, Canadians of Pakistani heritage, who are numerous and represent important people-to-people ties between our countries. And we have a growing number of Pakistani students in Canada. So these are some of the examples, and there are many more. So frankly, it's a very dynamic and positive relationship, and I think there are great prospects for it to continue to grow in future years.
You've talked of many aspects. You've talked about trade, you've talked about people-to-people contact, you've talked about the development assistance that Canada provides to Pakistan. Could you enumerate a bit of the examples of the development assistance that you are giving in Pakistan?
Yes, our development assistance has evolved over the years. Priorities change over time. In the past, Canada has played a significant role in Pakistan in developing your country's hydroelectric capacity, to give an example. We also have programming in the area of education, also in the area of women's economic empowerment. We spoke earlier about how important it is to the Canadian government in terms of development to ensure the inclusion of women. So we have been supporting projects in Pakistan designed to develop the entrepreneurial skills of women so that they're able to be full participants in the economy of Pakistan. We've also provided significant amounts of humanitarian assistance, and a lot of this has been directed towards helping people who've been displaced in Pakistan by some of the conflict in recent years, and refugees from Afghanistan who've been in Pakistan. So those are some of the areas where our development program has been or is active at the current time.
All right. Excellency, also Pakistan is offering serious business opportunities for Canadian investors, for businesses which are actively pursuing certain projects in different sectors. Which sectors are those?
Well, in my travels throughout Pakistan, I've been struck at, I've seen a number of sectors where I see tremendous potential for the years ahead for Pakistan, and they are sectors in which Canada has great expertise and experience, and where I think the prospects for enhanced cooperation are enormous. And to mention some of them, one is agriculture. Pakistan already has a very strong agricultural base, but I think in terms of value added to the production, I think Canadian companies would have a lot to offer. Another area is energy, both traditional oil and gas, but also renewable energy. We touched on before, there are Canadian companies with state-of-the-art technology in solar energy, and some are looking at investments in Pakistan. Another area is the ICT sector. We received a delegation just a couple of months ago from a Canadian company that has ICT or software for the pharmaceutical sector, and they were very well received in Pakistan. Another area is mining. Canada has a great mining tradition, and Pakistan is a country that has hardly started to develop its mining resources, so that's another example. So there are quite a number of areas where I think the potential for strengthened ties between the Canadian private sector and that of Pakistan is great, and I hope to see in time that this potential is turned into reality.
All right. When you talk of potential turning into reality, do you feel that there are certain sectors that could be explored to bind both nations together in the future? Any avenues that you feel could be explored in the future?
Well, I would say some of the sectors I've just mentioned are ones we should be focusing on. Renewable energy, I think, is a very important one. I've seen in Pakistan, and this is true about a lot of other countries around the world, that the lack of reliable and affordable electricity supply holds back your country's development. I hear from business people that load shedding and so forth, it makes it difficult because companies have to have generators then and so forth in order to maintain production. So that's an area where Canada has great expertise in energy. The need is significant in Pakistan. I know there's a political commitment here to make progress in that area, so that's one where I would like to see more cooperation. Another is in the sector of education. We spoke earlier about the strong education system in Canada. I think there's great scope and opportunities and interest in the part of Pakistan for enhanced exchanges and cooperation between Pakistani universities and Canadian universities, and also polytechnic institutes. So those are some of the areas where I see great potential.
Great. So on a kind of goodbye note, what kind of message would you like to give to our viewers and to Pakistanis and to those who are investing in Canada, to the Canadians who are investing in Pakistan? What is the message that you'd like to give?
Well, a couple of messages. I would like to firstly thank Pakistanis for such a warm welcome to their country. I've really enjoyed very much my time here, and everywhere I've traveled throughout Pakistan, people have received me with great kindness. Secondly, I would say I think Pakistanis should be very proud of their country's, your country's tremendous history and cultural heritage. You really have a lot to be proud of, and the natural beauty of your country as well. But thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, I would say I see great potential in Pakistan, especially in the youth of Pakistan. I see tremendous energy. I've met so many people, young people and also not so young people, who are very committed and striving to see Pakistan develop and achieve its full potential. And as Canadian High Commissioner, I look forward to finding ways that I can work with them and encourage Canadian private sector and government and others to work with Pakistanis to help your country achieve its full potential, and to the benefit of Pakistan and also, of course, to the benefit of Canada.
Well, thank you so very much, Mr. Perry Colderwood. That was the High Commissioner of Canada, and nobody else could have said it better. They are working for the relationship between Pakistan and Canada to become even stronger, as has been the case in the previous years. And we can only see a more strengthened, a more fructuous, a more fruitious relationship between both countries in the years, in the decades to come. Omer, Khalid, but bids you farewell from this episode of Diplomatic Enclave. We'll be back, inshallah, next week, same time, same channel. Take care of yourselves. Allah Hafiz and Excellency. Thank you so very much for giving us the time.
Bahut shukriya. Thank you very much.